Welcome to Hide and Create, your online writing workshop.
I should have started drinking before I logged on.
Danger, Will Robinson, danger.
You know what? I'm already lost.
That's your thing, Jordan.
Wow.
You say something and you go, right?
Is this being recorded? Magic mice creatures.
I should have thought of that.
Good! See, I knew I set myself up.
You guys have been passing the joint around while I was going at it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for being ridiculous there. I could put that in the intro.
Welcome back to another episode of Hide and Create. Today's topic is world building, and with me today are my co-hosts, Moses Siregar, Joshua Essoe, and Jaye Wells, who is stepping into Diana Rowland's shoes for a few weeks while Diana tackles some personal issues that have taken her away from the show. So I thought that we'd just start by having Jaye introduce herself, and then we'd come back and talk a little bit about world building. So Jaye, over to you.
Hey guys. Well, I have to say filling in Diana's shoes is a big project. She is a pretty impressive lady. But I am Jaye Wells. I write urban fantasy for Orbit. I am a USA Today bestseller. My first series with Orbit was the Sabina Cain series, and the fifth book of that series came out last year. That was the final book, and it won RT Book Review's Best Urban Fantasy of 2012, which was very exciting. And this summer I put out a new series of novellas, well, the first of a new series called Meridian 6, which is a dystopian world where vampires have kind of subjugated humans into these blood camps. And then my new series for Orbit will launch in January, and it's called the Prospero's War series, and the first book is Dirty Magic, and I pitched that series as The Wire with Wizards. So it's cops who are going after wizards who sell illegal dirty magic on the streets, like a drug dealer would in our world. So that's all very exciting. Ben, I'm super excited to talk about world building today because it's one of my favorite parts of writing.
Jaye, didn't you have a Breaking Bad type thing going on somewhere too?
Yeah, the new series has been described as Breaking Bad with magic instead of meth, and which is like a really cool comparison given how awesome that show is. I don't know if you guys are watching it, but I cannot.
Just won the Emmys.
No, it's so good. It's so good. I'm a little scared about the comparison, given how great it is. But
just I haven't seen the latest season, so nobody talked about it.
No spoilers. Yeah. So Jaye, first of all, you're stepping into the shoes of our traditional writer slot, so you're representing everybody that's been published through one of the big 6 publishing houses, big 5 publishing houses now, I guess.
Yeah.
Random Penguin.
So, when you're pitching your new series, did you start on the world building first, or did you think of what your current readership might like? Were you trying to branch out into a new readership? How did that work?
Well, for me, everything starts pretty much with world building. I usually have like a situation, like a cop is trying to arrest wizards who are like drug dealers, because I had The Wire with Wizards pretty early. But then I sat down and hashed out what this world would look like. I had to figure out what kind of magic it was. I didn't want it to be the kind of magic where somebody could just wave a hand and zap somebody else. I wanted it to be like a physical magic, like a potion. So I started, researching alchemy and all sorts of different magical traditions and things like that and kind of built the world from there. But, I actually, obviously I was considering what my, established readership would, want, but ultimately it's about, finding something that I'm really jazzed about, because if I'm not excited about the world, they won't be. And I am very, very excited about this world. But the cool thing was that since I was already established with Orbit and have a great relationship with my editor, Davy Pillay, I went to her and with kind of a non-traditional proposal where I sent in the first 3 chapters of the book as well as like a world Bible kind of document where I outlined the major players in the world and this kind of narrative about what the world is, because, in urban fantasy, often the setting becomes its own character. And I created a city in Ohio that doesn't really exist called Babylon. So I had to kind of explain what the city looks like and how it's a lot like a normal, like Cleveland or, a place like that. but how it also was different. And I honestly think the world is what sold the series, because they could tell that there was a lot to build on there. So,
you mentioned Cleveland. Did you start with an existing, like, do the streets match an existing city, or like how detailed did you get?
I stole elements from a lot of different cities because I was. Have you guys seen those like blogs online that show images of like abandoned buildings? There's like this whole movement of people who go and do like kind of the urban.
Love those.
Yeah, they. And so I had been kind of captured by those images and had been reading up on kind of this reemergence of the Rust Belt that's happening, where there's like a renaissance of people moving back into the Rust Belt, and there's a lot of like artisanship happening and like a lot of great food happening and things like that. So I started kind of researching the Rust Belt and the history of what caused, its downfall and all this stuff. And I was really intrigued by it. And so I took a little bit of Cleveland and a little bit of Cincinnati and some Detroit. And so, and like I took, I can't remember, I think it's Cincinnati has an abandoned subway system that they just stopped.
Yeah, you're right. I heard about that.
And so I stole that and put it in Babylon, which is based on Cleveland in geography, and that it's on the lake and the Cuyahoga goes through it, but I called it the Steel River instead. So I took some kind of recognizable landmarks, but then I kind of bent them to my will, based on the fact that it wasn't actually Cleveland. It's this city, Babylon. So that's kind of how I built it. It's kind of this weird organic process of just me looking at cool things and being like, how can I use that? And then, and then using it. So
Moses, when you started your series, I guess with your first novel, The Black God's War, did you start like Jay did, or did you go another route? How did you figure that?
I wasn't jaded at all. No, I'm just kidding.
Wah, wah, wah.
We did a world building show a while ago. If any of our listeners haven't heard it, you can hear all of our fantastic wisdom on world building in our World Building 1 episode. And I'll try not to repeat things that I've forgotten that I've said in that show, but you could go back and listen to that show. Just want to mention that as well. In this show, I will say something actually in a second that's substantive, but really looking forward to hearing things that Jay said, Jay would say on the subject, because I know you've actually taught classes on world building. Is that right, Jay?
Yes, I taught workshops and things on it. Yeah.
Cool. So, yes, I was going to sit at the feet of Jay and soak up her wisdom today, but I did use a lot of historical elements in my story. So I have like elements of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and ancient India, and borrowed from, the Greek gods, borrowed from Buddhism, borrowed from all of the Judeo-Christian religions, and kind of made this like interesting mishmash of all these things that takes place in a secondary world, but still has a hint of the familiar about it from things that are a part of our world. And I found that was really helpful to me. It gave me some guidelines. And it's interesting because occasionally I've had a reader or reviewer say something like, well, I wish you'd kind of completely made up your own thing. And, I think there's fantasy fiction that does that, where you really completely make up things as different as you possibly can. And then some fiction where you do want some parallels to the real world. And for this series, I wanted some parallels to the real world. I wanted people to be able to recognize a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of Islam, a little bit of Judaism, a little bit of Buddhism and Hinduism. Enough that you kind of knew that there was some tie to the real world, but yet you were still in a far away place having this, fun romp with the story. So, but I think, in the future I may write a series and not do that at all. I think it's just kind of whatever mood you're in for that book, and maybe depending on what you want to achieve with that series may depend on whether or not you want to have world building that is like our world, or whether, you do want to just create something as fantastical as you possibly can.
Did you have any real world locations that inspired you like Jay did?
Trying to think of, any cities. I mean, there weren't any specific cities. There were, I did borrow names from some cities in ancient India. Like, Kanauj, I don't know how that's pronounced, but, that's like a name of an ancient city. So I did things like that, where I would actually steal from Sanskrit, including the cities. I would, when I gave people names in Resia, which is like the first culture in the story, all their names were kind of like these exotic Italian names. And then, I have another culture in my next book where I've borrowed from more Nordic, Norse sort of things. So that kind of helped me keep consistency to some extent with language in the story, was to use names that all came from a certain culture. And it's also a little bit recognizable, which I think some people can kind of appreciate. Maybe if an Indian reads my story and they recognize some of the typical or atypical, but still Indian names. There's a ring of the familiar that, some of those people may find interesting, may like.
I'm going to come back to Jay in just a minute. Joshua, with your clients, is there ever a time when you find there hasn't been enough world building? And if so, how do you coach them on that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I encountered that a lot, especially with stories that don't take place in, on Earth and things like that, of course. There are a couple of things that I look for when I'm editing a manuscript that the person has put in a lot of effort into making a new world, or, as the case may be, not putting a lot of effort into a world that maybe they should have. There are certain benchmarks that I think that they need to consider. History of their world, the geography, the zoology, so like what flora and fauna live there, governments and societies, the economy of those governments and societies, and what kind of technology do they have, or what kind of magic do they have, or the combination of the two. So these 6 main points can really, going down them in a list, you can just make a form, and you can really create an entire world just by answering these questions thoroughly. And so usually I can solve most problems just by, suggesting that list. There are a number of things that I see that could be mistakes to avoid when you're building a world. Maybe chief among those, or one of the more important ones at any rate, is not everybody is going to be wearing the same thing, right? They're not going to be thinking the same things. They're not going to be talking the same way. There's probably going to be some ethnic or socioeconomic diversity. It's not like in Star Trek where you land on the planet and everybody's wearing the white bodysuit, right? There's no planet uniform. So watch out for that, because I find that is probably the most frequent issue that I see, that it's not diverse enough, that people didn't put the thought into the details. And if they are all uniformed, there's just got to be really compelling, a really good reason for that. Because in real life, you put half a dozen people together in the same room, you're going to have, 7 or 8 different opinions. Everybody's thinking something different. Everybody's doing something different. Everybody's dressing differently. Remember diversity, not homogeny.
Perfect. So Jay, we're getting back to you already.
Great.
So have you ever actually worked in kind of a non-urban fantasy, like a pure epic fantasy world, or any of that? Have you worked in other genres? And if you have, how is urban fantasy different?
Well, most of my work is in urban fantasy. The Meridian 6 world is like kind of a dystopian, post-apocalyptic world, which is a little different because it's set in a world that used to be our world, but now it's completely changed. So I had to come up with, different elements for that. But I've done some writing in like paranormal romance, which requires, well, at least those books that I wrote didn't have a lot of world building in them, just because when I started writing so many years ago, I was terrified of world building because my only context for it was Tolkien. And I was like, I don't want to have to draw maps. I don't want to have to create languages. I don't have time for all that, so I kind of used kind of the shorthand, minimalistic world building for those. But then once I started writing urban fantasy, I was like, well, I'm going to do it my way. And when I started doing it my way, it was a lot more fun. But I don't have a lot of context for writing traditional fantasy world building. But hearing Moses speak, I realized that, there are some similarities. When in my Sabina Kane series, I had a bunch of different races. I called the dark races, but there was fae and wares and werewolves and vampires, mages, and all of that. And I did that same kind of having a template. Like the mages, I used a lot of like ancient Greece, like the naming, the way their government was put together, those kinds of things. The vampires had more kind of like a hardcore like Roman model. The Fae obviously had a big Celtic influence. And I used it in everything from naming conventions to the government, like I mentioned, how their culture works and things like that. So, I think it's a really useful trick if you can do it well, because, it also allows you to kind of have a shorthand for the reader, where if they can pick out something recognizable, it automatically speaks to what you're trying to convey. Like we have, like stereotypes of what Celtic culture is or what ancient Roman culture was. And so you don't have to go through and explain it all in these lengthy, blocks of text giving all of your, exposition of what this world is. It kind of allows you to take some shortcuts in that regard. So
how closely do you cleave to kind of real world examples? Like where do you know how to draw the line?
I'm sorry, about what specifically? Real world examples of what?
Well, you said Roman culture, for instance, right?
Well, the thing that I really like to do in my world building is take something that's familiar and twist it. So I'll use it as a jumping off point. So I'll start with, for example, like the whole basis of the world for this Sabina Kane series starts in the Garden of Eden. And so I take this ancient Jewish folklore about Lilith, which is that before God gave Eve to Adam, that there was this kind of wild woman named Lilith who, was kind of a ballsy broad who didn't want to follow Adam's rules. And so she kind of got sick of him and fled the garden and went off on her own. And so I took that as a jumping off point and said, well, that's where this kind of these kind of shadow races came from, was Lilith went off on her own and started her own races, which kind of set up the world building. So for me, it was important to kind of know the origin stories of all the races and build from there. But I don't feel confined at all by what already exists. And that's a really important point when you're writing about a being that has been written about a million times, like vampires, right? Like, a lot of people who haven't studied them think that a lot of the quote unquote rules of vampires are from folklore, but a lot of them are inventions of Hollywood.
What?
I know. Hollywood makes stuff up. But the whole thing about, with the issues with the sun, not being able to be in the sun is from, I think it's Nosferatu, the movie.
I think it's actually from Superman,
right.
The red sun. No, sorry,
right.
go on.
They can go in sunlight, they just get sparkly, okay?
Yes. I think that's a more modern invention of Hollywood, but yes. But no, so they needed a way to kill off the monster in the movie. So they had the sun come up and he, raises his hand. It's this iconic image. Yeah. And so, really these rules that exist in the canon were created by other writers. So my theory is, if another writer made that rule, I can break it and create my own rules. So I kind of take what already exists and twist it a little bit. So, I think that's really fun. That's fun for me. That's one of the reasons I really enjoy world building.
Yeah, I've kind of often talked about the lack of American folklore. There's no American mythology really. American mythology borrows from Norse mythology, right? Which is, it's not even real mythology. It's just some writer made it up in the 1700s. And Greek mythology and stuff like that, right? We're always referencing those other mythologies. There isn't really an American mythology. Maybe one of the reasons is because Hollywood is kind of creating it and has unfortunately copyrighted it.
Well, there is Native American mythology. Yeah. And then, I would, and I don't mean to offend anybody when I say this, but I think Christianity heavily influences American mythology. If we consider Norse mythology and Roman mythology and all of that just myths, those were religions. And so, we borrow a lot from the symbols and archetypes of religions to create our stories. And so I think, kind of anything is fair game. I mean, if you think about, my good friend Kevin Hearn, who has the really wonderful Iron Druid series. I mean, he's got everybody from, Jesus shows up in his books, Darth Vader's in his books. I mean, he's kind of like everybody
That's much A to Z, right?
Like everything is fair game. And it's so wonderful to see him not feel confined by one specific type of mythology, as a lot of us just kind of, a lot of people just say, oh, my book is based on Norse mythology, or not Norse. I'm lisping now. But, I think it's really fun to play with all of that. And, of course some people say, well, these kinds of mythologies aren't selling. Well, you should be the person who takes it and makes it really awesome so it can start, because I think there's so many great ones that aren't explored as much. So.
Do you want to shoot some out just for our listeners who might be looking for some ideas?
See, I knew I set myself up.
Yeah, they do that to me occasionally too.
Jordan's always the first to ask you for an example of what you just said.
Well, I think Native American mythology. I'm sure there are writers who are using it, but I think there's so much there. And Indian would be one, I guess, that isn't used a whole lot. Mesopotamian. I don't know. I could just list a bunch of random ones.
No. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. It's funny though. I have a story. Basically, I wanted to, go elsewhere for my mythology, and like you just said. And so I looked into, a lot of Aztec mythology, which wasn't super huge, 5-6 years ago. So I started writing all these Aztec stories, and all of a sudden I read Aliette de Bodard, who is just an incredible, won a ton of awards author, and she wrote the exact same, basically, story that I had based on the same mythology, and I guess because there weren't a lot of people writing in it, you could just write about the main, myths in that pantheon or whatever. You could reference them because it was undiscovered country, and it just so happened that we'd both kind of gone after the main myths, and of course she'd done it a lot better than I had.
Oh, that sucks.
Shoot.
Yeah, but sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that kind of brings up a point, which is, especially in urban fantasy, the world building, people who read urban fantasy don't want to read the same kind of world building that they've read in another book. And so it's super important when you're world building for urban fantasy that you're bringing something new to the table, some new twist on a myth, which is not easy to do, especially if you're writing about something like vampires, which I really wouldn't recommend writing about vampires right now. But unless you can do it really well and bring something new to the table.
Publishers get overbought, though. Even if you bring something new to the table, sometimes they just happen to have bought 4 vampire authors, right? Well,
and what's interesting is, you asked when I was thinking about pitching a new series. I actually pitched a new series to my publisher that they rejected. Yes, we still get rejected.
Was it vampire zombies?
It wasn't. It was actually a psychopomp story, and they happened to already have somebody who worked for death, and it was completely different. It was a completely different tone. It was a completely different type of story, but they were like, well, we already have that slot filled. We don't want these books competing. And, at the end of the day, I think it worked out really well because I think that the dirty magic world is much more compelling and, I think it will work out better in the long run. But at the time I was like, come on, but, they have to think about that stuff. And, they don't, they'll have somebody with a series coming out that's set in a location. Like they'll have somebody with a New Orleans set series. So they don't want to buy too many New Orleans books, and it's especially difficult once you already have an established relationship with a publisher, because it's not like you can say, well, I'm just going to walk away from you after we have this relationship established. You have to decide whether it's a hill you want to die on. But, I think ultimately the first thing you need to do is just try and do the best thing you can with the world and then see what happens with it. I don't think you should choose the world based on, what's selling. Cause with the vampire thing keeps coming up. I keep bringing it up, but, there are so many people who started writing vampire fiction because it was hot, but those people never had read a book with a vampire in it in their life. And it's like, why would you spend all this time writing a book about a vampire when you don't even enjoy the fiction? And so I think it's important that you really are compelled by...
Yeah, that you like what you write.
Yeah. Because it shows. It shows.
All right,
Definitely.
we are running out of time now, so we have to go to...
Let me interject one quick thing. I thought of something, because you asked me earlier also about what I see in my clients, and talking about using other nationalities and cultures and things like that in your writing to use as a basis for your world building. I just wanted to add that be real careful when you give your cultures and your nationalities, and make sure that they're more than just wallpaper. Because I see this problem frequently. If you're going to take an alien race or a fantasy culture and you're going to base them off of Canadians, right? Except these guys, these aliens, they have 3 eyes and 3 arms, and their extra arm looks like a hockey stick.
Much like some Canadians that I know.
Yeah, and you're gonna call them Anadians with a Z, right? So even if you're going to do that, the Anadians with a Z are going to need more than beer and maple syrup and hockey, eh?
No, we don't. That's what we get by on that now.
No, the culture that you're making does. You're going to have to make them nuanced. You're going to have to flesh them out, make it a believable culture. How does the government differ from your protagonists if your protagonist is not one of them? How has that government and their environment and their history shaped them? If you're going to go off of Canadians, then make sure that you're going to have that you research and you make sure that you have a very good idea of what it is like to be Canadian, what Canada is like, and that you're confident you can portray it with the depth and sensitivity and accuracy, right? Otherwise, you end up with trade confederacy Asians and Native American Wookiees, right? So, yeah, just if you're going to base it off of a living culture or a dead culture, whatever, make sure that you spend the time to figure out what that culture was like, how yours can be different, and why it's the same. Give it lots of detail.
And that brings up a point that I make in my workshop that I give on world building. I did this thing. I'm not going to say these because there are people listening who actually speak Klingon, I'm sure, but and Dothraki. But these are my 2 examples, because when you're building the world, like even down to the insults that they use, say something about the culture. There's this Dothraki insult that are saying it's take his braid. And if you know anything about the Dothrakis, that's a really important thing. Their braids are super important. And so to take his braid is a big deal. And then there's a Klingon insult that says your mother has a smooth forehead, which also says something about Klingon. So, it can, there's this kind of macro level of world building, which is what does the government look like? What is their religion like? What is their mode of dress? What is their, religion, like all that stuff. But then there's this kind of micro level of world building, which comes in with the details, and the details can really add a lot of depth and breadth to your world, and can make it seem very three-dimensional if you're specific and you tie those into the macro world building and says something about the culture of these people. So,
Moses, did you have any final thoughts?
You're going to have readers who are really into world building, especially if you write fantasy like I do. I'm probably not like naturally that much of a world building guy, and so. I have been making a much more concerted effort to really do a great job with the world building as I'm writing book 2. I thought book 1 going into it I knew was like passable, good enough for me. But even though there's a lot of stuff going on, I still didn't feel like it was a really great world building book. But I feel like I've put more into that, and already with the preview that I've released, I've had reviews where people are really praising the world building, which is good because that's actually something I really wanted to do more of. But my encouragement to you, dear listener, is, realize that you're going to have readers who who are really into the world building. If you're already a world building person, you don't need to hear what I'm saying. If you're not so much, then you're going to have people who are really going to want that in your story, and make a really, strong effort to give them that, because those are going to be happy readers for you, and it's one of the many things you have to do well if you're going to write books.
All right. So as the tie-in writer, I didn't really speak too much in this episode because for almost everything that I've done, the world is complete. In fact, I'm given a production Bible, which describes the world, and then I am not allowed to change it under any circumstances, because my little book isn't the only thing set in that world, and they don't, canon retconning is a big thing, right? That the fans like the world to stay contiguous. In fact, I've had several pitches rejected because, you change the world too much. I mean, sometimes you change specific characters too much. So I spoke a little bit about how I make stories my own, set within the worlds that I'm working in the last world building episode that we did. But I can talk a little bit about the Facebook game I'm launching later this year, for which it's called Dragon Assault. And it's, I hired writers to produce stories set in the world of Dragon Assault, and I gave them a production Bible of my own. And I did a lot of what Jay was talking about, where basically the ogres I gave, they have Roman names, right? And their culture is very, romanticized, right? And the goblins have Indian names and so on, right? So they all kind of borrow from those cultures, but then, you think, what would a steampunk India look like? And, set it underground, those are the goblins. So that gave a lot of kind of, even though there wasn't a game yet for the writers to go on, that gave them a lot of kind of continuity to work with. And the stories that they met, even though they each went away and wrote stories set in this world that didn't exist yet, because of the production Bible, their stories all kind of match. They're not dramatically different. So, yeah, I don't know if you're interested in writing in tie-ins. What you can do is, the first thing you can do is just ask for the production Bible, if there aren't rule books out there already for you to buy. So I'm just going to throw it out there one last time. Anybody else have any closing thoughts before we sign off?
I have a final thought.
Go.
One of your favorite things for me to say.
Yeah.
Just another thing that, and I said the first one I said was important. This one I think is the most important. Every society has checks and balances, right? So what I mean by that is, once you think of your world, once you get it all built, break it. Your magic and your technology and your economy and your government, they don't exist all in bubbles. They're not independent of one another, and each will have a significant effect on all of the others. So consider, for example, replicators. Imagine what kind of massive effect technology like that would have on our world right now. Grocery stores? No. Farms? What would we need those for? How many hundreds of thousands of people would be out of work if replicators suddenly came into existence? What new businesses would erupt in support of replicators? Maybe there would be...
It's happening. 3D printers. That's a replicator.
Yeah, okay. So there's probably going to be all kinds of stores springing up that sell special mods for those. Companies that build custom, whatever those are called, build them right into your home. Industrial-sized replicators for restaurants. Would there even still be restaurants? People are always going to want to get together in social groups and eat, right? So how would they be different if replicators were created? Same with transporters. Think of airlines, taxis, automobiles, the oil companies. So once you come up with your super cool ideas, take them out of their bubbles, unwrap them, and then inflict them on your world in as many bastard ways as you can think of, so that your readers don't do it.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much, Joshua. So with that, I am going to bid our listeners goodbye until next week, when we'll be doing a show on the hero's journey. Thanks very much.
This has been another episode of Hide and Create. The show is produced by me, Jordan Ellinger. The site is edited by Joshua Essoe, and my co-hosts have been Jaye Wells and Moses Siregar. That music that you're listening to was written by Jason Donnelly. We can be reached at writingpodcastonline.com, where you can ask us questions or suggest topics for future shows. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider reviewing us on iTunes, liking our Facebook page, or subscribing to the Hide and Create YouTube channel. That's all for now. Now go hide and create something.